All right, so we are going to now start our videos on section 1.8, which is going to introduce the idea of absolute values into some ideas we've already covered. So like normal, I've divided this section up into two different videos. The first one, we're going to look at the idea of just absolute value equations. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about absolute value inequalities, which will tie in what we covered in section 1.7. So absolute value equations aren't too bad. They do require one extra step of solving you'll have to do, but here's kind of how the idea works. Let's assume that you have an algebraic expression and it involves an absolute value with a constant on the right-hand side. And so all that to be said, what happens if you end up solving in a problem that looks like this, where you have the absolute value of something, we'll call it U for right now, is equal to C? Well, what we know about absolute values is that if you take the absolute value of a positive number and a negative number, they give you positive answers. So why that causes a little bit of a constraint for us is that we will have to divide this up into two separate problems to do. Once you get the absolute value by itself on the left-hand side and you have the number on the right, what you will do is you will take whatever is inside the absolute value and we will set that equal to C. But what you also have to do is take that same U value and set it equal to negative C, because the absolute value of negative C would also be the same positive C in this problem. Now, what I'll also mention here in this problem is that if you look back at the beginning, this says that your C value must be greater than 0. That's because if you end up with an absolute value is equal to a negative number, that's impossible to solve because an absolute value can never equal a negative number. So you will only work the problems if it's positive or if it's a 0 value, because we can do an absolute value to get 0. And so using that information, I've got, I think, 4 or 5 problems to work for you, all involving absolute value equations. So let's begin with kind of a warm-up problem. Number 1, you have that the absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to 7. Well, as you can see on this one, the absolute value piece is already by itself, which is good. And on the right-hand side, you have a positive number. That means you can actually solve this problem. So what we will do is we will take this information that's inside the absolute value and we will write it twice, x minus 1 and x minus 1. On the first one, you will set it equal to exactly the number that you see on the right-hand side. And on the second one, you will set it equal to the negative of that number. And then your job is just to solve these separately. So on both of these, we are going to add 1 to both sides of the equation. That's going to be the nice thing today, is a lot of commonality. And so you end up with x equals 7 plus 1, which is 8. That's one answer. And on the second one, negative 7 plus 1 is negative 6. And that's it. That's how you will solve an absolute value equation. But like I said, you'll only do it if it is an absolute value equals a positive number. When you look at number 2 here, you'll notice that you have the absolute value of 6x plus 7 minus 8 needs to equal 3. Well, the problem with this one is that you don't have the absolute value piece by itself. So what you will need to do first is move that negative 8 to the other side of the equation before you begin. So I'm going to do that by adding 8 to both sides. So I can bring down the absolute value piece. And then I know that 3 plus 8 is going to give me 11. So once again, you have an absolute value equals a positive number. So just like earlier, I can now take the 6x plus 7 that's inside the absolute value, and I'm going to write it twice. The first one I'm going to set equal to the 11 that I picked up on the right-hand side, and the second one I'm going to set equal to negative 11. Now I'm now going to work these individually. So on the first one, I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides. This will give me 6x equals 4. And if I divide both sides by 6, and you simplify this, 4 and 6 both share a 2 in common. So if you divide both those numbers by 2, you should get x equals 2/3. On the second one, if I subtract 7 from both sides, you will end up with 6x equals negative 18. And then if you divide both sides by 6, you will end up getting a final answer of x equals negative 3. And so once again, number 2, you get 2 solutions to your final answer here. And so that's kind of the blueprint of how you will solve absolute value equations. What I want to show you now is a couple of weird examples that you might run into, and you need to make sure you know how to handle those. So let's look at number 3. You have the absolute value of 7x plus 3 is equal to 0. Well, by our rule, you need to get the absolute value by itself on one side and the number on the other. This time, though, the number is 0. It's not a positive number. So how is that going to change how we work this? Well, let me kind of show you the issue. If you were to follow our same blueprint and you were to write 7x plus 3 down twice, well, like I said, the first one you set equal to the exact number you found. And the second one, it says to set equal to the negative of it. But as we should know, you can't take the negative of 0. That's impossible. A negative 0 and a regular 0 are the exact same thing. So what ends up happening here is you end up duplicating the two equations. So in this case, I actually can ignore this second equation because you're going to get the exact same answer. And so I'm only going to solve the first one, and I'm going to do that by subtracting 3 from both sides to get 7x equals negative 3, and then dividing both sides by 7 will give me x equals negative 3/7. And this is a rare example where you only get one answer because you weren't able to take the negative of the 0 from the beginning. All right, number 4 is another one. You've got the absolute value of 4x minus 1 is equal to a negative 5. Now, this one is going to take the least amount of work of all of them because, unfortunately, there's absolutely nothing you can do with this problem. The issue here is this is a negative number. And as we talked about at the beginning of this video, if you have an absolute value on one side, there is no way you can take the absolute value of something and get a negative answer. It just doesn't work that way. You can take the absolute value and you can get a positive number. You can take the absolute value and you can get 0, but you're never ever going to get a negative answer. So you don't need to do any work on this problem. In this case, there is no way you can solve this. So I know immediately that your answer is no solution. All because the right-hand side was a negative when the absolute value was by itself on one side of the equation. All right, and so to wrap up this video, let me show you probably worst case scenario where you have the most work to do. So on number 5, it says 2 times the absolute value of x minus 1 minus 7 needs to equal negative 3. Now, one mistake I do see students make here is that they see that negative 3 on the right-hand side and they immediately go, oh, the answer is no solution. Well, don't do that. You can only say it's no solution if the absolute value is by itself and there's still a negative number. So until you get that absolute value piece by itself, you can't say no solution just yet. So what I would do is try to get the absolute value by itself. I would add 7 to both sides first. That would give me 2 times the absolute value of x minus 1 is going to equal 4. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2, which will give me the absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to positive 2. And now you see, there's no issues with this because you ended up getting a positive number on the right-hand side. So over here on the right, but back to the first two problems we did today, you will take what's inside the absolute value, and we're going to write it twice. The first one will equal the exact number that you got, which is this 2, and the other one will equal the negative of that, which is negative 2. And now you just need to solve them separately. So on both of them, all you have to do is add 1 to both sides, because that will naturally cancel the negative 1 and give you your 2 answers. So on the first one, 2 plus 1 is going to give us 3. And on the second one, negative 2 plus 1 gives us negative 1. And that is your 2 solutions to number 5 with just a little bit of extra work at the very beginning here. So that ends my first video on section 1.8. In this video, we covered absolute value equations. In the next part of this video, I'm going to bring back the inequalities that we did in section 1.7, and I'm going to mix in some absolute values with those, and we'll talk about how you will go about working those for your assignments.